Welcome to this presentation for the 2020 Northwest GIS Conference. My name is David Howes, and the title of my presentation is ArcGIS Pro Add Ins, an introduction for the GIS layperson. For those of you who don't know me, I have degrees from the UK and the US. I've been involved with GIS for a long time, and I've been operating my own business since 2012, specializing in GIS tools, processes, and supporting infrastructure. In 2014, I created the website gispd.com, GIS Professional Development, and do a variety of helpful things for GIS professionals under that banner. As the title suggests, I'll provide an introduction to ArcGIS Pro Add Ins and their development, and in doing that, I'll try to keep the explanations as simple and clear as possible. That way, the presentation should be of value to a wide range of GIS professionals, from those with a casual interest in the topic to those who may want to develop add-ins of their own. I'll explain the rationale for looking at add-ins, show some examples, and then look at the technology, continuing with add-in creation and deployment. I'll talk about events, and then wrap up with resources and some considerations. First, the rationale for focusing on add-ins. When you invest in ArcGIS Pro, you can do a lot with the out-of-the-box functionality, but that will only give you access to a fraction of its capabilities. So to really get your money's worth, you can configure the program via the settings, you can write Python and Arcade scripts, or you can extend the program using the ArcGIS Pro software development kit for .NET, the SDK. In case you're not familiar with the term, an SDK is simply a set of software tools that can be used to produce applications. And when I say extend the program, what I mean is that you can build on the technology underlying ArcGIS Pro to streamline tasks, to provide new functionality, and to enhance the user experience. To do that, Esri provides what are called extensibility patterns, of which there are currently 4. Pro Add-ins, which, as the name suggests, allow you to add functionality. Managed configurations allow you to make what some call branded versions of the software, where, for example, you may have your own splash screen and might limit the functionality to support particular workflows. Plug-in data sources bridge the gap between unsupported data formats and the program functionality, and core host applications allow external programs to make use of the geodatabase and geometry functionality. We're going to focus on the first one, and it's worth remembering that if they're developed appropriately, add-ins can often pay for themselves, perhaps many times over, in terms of cost savings and efficiency gains. With that introduction, let's take a look at a couple of examples. The first of which is an ArcMap feature navigation add-in. Of course, this is an ArcGIS Pro presentation, but what I'd like to do is start with something I created for ArcMap and then show you what a similar add-in looks like for ArcGIS Pro. Here's that map with a single layer, Washington counties. Now if I want to zoom from county to county in turn, what I can do is open the attribute table, right click on a record, and it'll zoom to the feature. There's Grant County, Lincoln, Whitman, Cowlitz, and Chelan. Now the reason I did so many was because I want to make the point that that gets old really quickly. A few years ago I had a situation where I had hundreds of polygons to go through like that, and it was going to drive me mad, so I thought, well, I can't do that, I'm going to do something about it. So I created an add-in. This is created using .NET, C#, and ArcObjects, which is the technology underlying ArcGIS Desktop. So I pick a layer, pick a field, there's the name field, and the list gets loaded with the values from that field. In this case, county names. So if I double click on Adams, I zoom to that feature. I can also use these buttons to go forward and back, like that. Now that's the kind of thing that you would think would be out-of-the-box functionality, especially in ArcGIS Pro, but it's not, so that's why I had to do it myself. This zoom factor here allows me to zoom right out. If I zoom to the next feature, there we go. And let's go back in again. Move to the next one. I can apply definition queries, turn that off. I can select features, turn that off too. Just clear the selection. I can do multi-selection like that, select them on the map, zoom to them like that. And I can export values by just clicking on that. That will take the values from the list box and dump them out to a text file. So as you can see, it's a fairly simple tool, but it's very valuable. Saved me a lot of time. The thing is, it's not perfect. It does crash every now and again, and one or two things don't work very well. But it doesn't matter because I'm the only person who used it, and it was fine for what I needed, and I could always fix it if I had to. There's only one map to work with, so that makes life fairly easy. And the way it works behind the scenes is these values in the list here are text values. And if you click on one, the code behind the scenes takes that value, finds the corresponding feature by doing a query on that value, and then you can zoom to it. So it's fairly basic in principle, but it's been really good for me. In fact, I've used this as the basis for workshops and presentations on occasions before, and it's worked very nicely. So that's it for ArcMap. Like many GIS professionals, I've made the move to ArcGIS Pro, so I wanted to reproduce the feature navigation functionality and add more capabilities. I wanted to learn to develop using the ArcGIS Pro SDK, and I wanted to be prepared to support clients and teach workshops. As you may appreciate though, ArcGIS Pro is quite different from ArcMap. It doesn't make all the functionality available at once, it just gives you what you need for a particular situation, which is why you see the ribbon change and functionality come and go depending on the circumstances. It does multiple things at once via what's called multi-threading to keep the interface responsive. And as I indicated earlier, ArcGIS Pro is highly configurable and extensible. As for the SDK, it's come a long way since it was first introduced in 2016, and we can do a lot more than is possible with the ArcGIS desktop technology. But one thing to bear in mind is that we can only use .NET since ArcGIS Pro is built using .NET technology. That means Java can't be used like it could for ArcGIS Desktop. So let's take a look at an ArcGIS Pro version of the add-in I just showed you. Here we have ArcGIS Pro. I've got 3 map panes and a catalogue pane, and each map pane looks almost identical. I'm using the same Washington County's map layer that you saw earlier for the ArcMap demo. Up at the top, you'll see this GIS PD Utils tab. That's new, it's not standard functionality, it's part of my add-in. If I click on it, you'll see this map group and then a feature navigation button. Hover over it and the feature navigation tooltip is there, and it says open the feature navigation dockable window. Before I do that, let me just click on this catalogue pane over here and activate it. Now go back to the tab and you'll see that the button is disabled. Hover over it again and it says feature navigation. This command is currently unavailable. This tool requires an active map pane. So the idea is that the functionality is consistent with what you would expect from ArcGIS Pro, and in this case it is. So let's activate map 1. Now the button's enabled and I can click on it. Right here you can see the modern version of the feature navigation add-in. Anybody who was at the Northwest GIS conference in Bend last year may recognize this and hopefully can see that it's come on a little bit. Looks a bit different, and certainly underneath a lot has changed. It's much tidier than it was then, as I've learned a lot more. Now in terms of design, I've made it deliberately narrow, and so I can move this divider over as close as possible, and it's still usable. And the idea there is that you get it out the way and you keep the map as big as possible and as clear. So that's why I did that. Move it back out again. Now one of the things that's different from the ArcMap add-in is this drop down here to pick a map. I've got 3 maps to choose from, and currently map 1 is the active one. So I'll pick map 2, and notice now that map 2 is activated by the add-in and map 2 is associated. Now you don't have that in ArcMap, of course, because you don't need it. There's only one map. I'll pick a layer, map 2 counties, and then I'll pick the name field just like I did before. And now I've got these name values in the list box, and you'll see some functionality down here that got enabled. If you're really observant, you'll notice that the zoom factor was already enabled, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. There are definitely still some bugs left in this, but it's a work in progress. I'm using this to learn the SDK and try different things, and I'm reaching a point now though where I'm wrapping it up so that I can send it to Esri as a community sample if they'll accept it, and I'd also like to send the add-in to people so that they can get the same benefit out of it as I do. So there's just 1 or 2 little bugs left. That's one of them. That should have been disabled until I had some values. Another one is about to come up, and there's one more which you may not see today, but those are the only 3 I know about at this point. And I might add 1 or 2 more capabilities as well. I'll see how it goes. So if I double click on Adams County here, there you go, Adams value and Adams feature over here now, and you'll see that I can't go back. The button's disabled, which makes sense. If I go down to Douglas, double click on that, now I'm at Douglas, and if I click next, keep clicking next, you see the field value there becomes visible as I go down. It's kept in view. And that may not seem much, but it's actually quite tricky to do that in WPF. So again, this is a learning experience for me, and the more I can do of this kind of thing as practice, the better it'll be for my clients and classes and what have you. So let's multi-select some features, and bingo, there's the next bug I'm inadvertently introducing. And let me pick some values here, and let me click apply. Now that button wasn't there before either, and well, I've done something, but it's not quite obvious what. So let me click on set definition query and apply that, and now it's a bit clearer what I did. I set a definition query for Garfield, Franklin, Grant, and Cowlitz counties. One thing to notice is that this clear definition button is now enabled. That button is tied directly to the map layer, so that if the map layer gets a definition query, like it just did, that button becomes enabled, otherwise it isn't enabled. And similarly, if I select features, click apply there, now the map has a selection, and that button recognizes that and is automatically enabled. And you could do that sort of thing before, but it's much, much cleaner now in the SDK and in modern C# and .NET. So the zoom factor is still there, just like before, nothing really to mention there. One other thing I'd like to mention is this. I've got the definition query still set, so if I refresh the field values, now the list is just that set that passed through the definition query. And that's quite useful. If you have a case like this, it may not seem much, but if you have many thousands of features, for example, you can drill down into your data set and then start to work through them. So if I go back up here and then just work my way through them like that, it's quite clean. I can export the values just like before, and the list of values that gets exported is just whatever's in that list box at the time. So that's quite nice. So that's probably all I want to say really about this functionality right here. But what I want to do is just mention a few other things that relate to how this add-in relates to the rest of the document. So right here we've got map 2 associated, selected there, it's active, and if I go and get rid of this layer, the tool's not going to like that. As you can see, it says the tool has been reset because the selected map layer was removed. Fair enough. Hopefully that's a friendly enough message so you know what to do. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go to map 3 here. Now I've got map 3. Let me just dismiss that. There we go. Pick the layer map 3 counties this time. Pick the name field, and we're back in business. But if I get rid of the map 3 map pane there, that's a bit of a delay. It's doing some thinking, whatever it's doing. And this says the tool has been reset because the selected map was closed. Again, hopefully that's a friendly enough error message to let you know what's going on. And by the way, if you do actually get a genuine error, you'll see it down at the bottom here. So that's really more of a notification, but an error would come down here at the bottom with a similar one of those little panels, and it would be all in red. So that's hopefully user friendly, because whatever you do, you don't want your add-in to crash or crash the program for that matter. So the code does have really good error handling in place, and like I said, it'll appear, the message will appear down here in red. So if I now close both of these map documents and then I try resetting the tool, it says no maps were found. Please open or create a map containing at least one feature layer and reset the tool. So again, hopefully that's friendly enough. Now, one thing to think about is what happens when you close the project. And initially, when I was starting to develop this, I thought, well, you've got to save the state and the user will expect to come back and carry on where they left off. And that can be a bit tricky. It certainly can be done. But then I thought, well, what does Esri do? And so I went to the geoprocessing tools and I opened one and I entered some information, and then I closed the project and opened it back up again, and all that was gone. Everything I did was reset, and I thought, you know what, that's good, clean, it's simple, and if I make it consistent with the way that works, I think that users will understand that and expect it. And so that's what I did. And right now I've still got a bit to sort out, because what will happen is when you close the project, it will close, but it'll start to give you these messages, and that's because the map pane closes before the project closes, which makes sense, and this is still listening for that, and it will know when the map pane, where the map pane closed, and it will respond accordingly. So I'd like to sort of intercept that and say, well, look, if you go and press that X up here, or go and choose the exit, the close function any other way, it will actually say, all right, I'm not going to worry about messages at this point. I'm just going to get out cleanly as possible and close up. And that's about it. I think don't need to say any more about the add-in at this point. What I'll do is I'll return to the slides, and then later on I'll show you how this thing's made and refer back to some of this functionality from a different angle. As you could see from the demo, the ArcGIS Pro add-in is richer and more complex than the ArcMap version. For example, in the ArcMap version of the add-in, the drop-down lists were loaded with text values that were used to look up features before the zoom or selection could be applied. In the Pro version, the drop-down controls are loaded with objects, so the map drop-down is loaded with map pane objects, the layer drop-down is loaded with layer objects, and the field drop-down is loaded with field objects. The reason this is helpful is that when I do something like zoom, I don't have to go and find the object representing the layer. I already have it available from the user selection. I can then use its zoom function with details of the zoom extent. As I showed in the demo, controls are responsive to the layer and map states. So for example, if there's no selection for the selected layer, the clear selection button is automatically disabled. Likewise, if the selected map is closed, the tool resets itself. These things mean that the underlying code is cleaner and more efficient than the underlying code in the ArcMap version. Now I'm going to give you an overview of the technology and then show you how I built the add-in. The development framework is Microsoft.NET, which you can think of as a big box of software pieces that can be used to put together programs like ArcGIS Pro and the add-in I showed you. The programming language is C#, and the program in which I do the development is called Visual Studio. And then we have the ArcGIS Pro SDK, which consists of .NET capabilities specific to ArcGIS Pro. We also use something called Windows Presentation Foundation, or WPF, a model view model development pattern, and asynchronous programming, and I'll explain these three items next. WPF is a framework for developing graphical user interfaces, and you can learn all about it from this excellent tutorial. If you want to build add-ins yourself, I thoroughly recommend working through the whole thing. Model view model, or MVVM, is what's called a design pattern. Just think of it as a way to cleanly organize code into three parts: the view, which is the part that represents the user interface, the view model, which is the part that handles the logic underlying the interface, and the model, which represents the data supporting the view model. The big advantage of this approach is not only that it makes your code cleaner, but it allows different people to work on different parts according to their expertise. With WPF, the view is created using a language called XAML, which you'll see soon. The view model is developed using C#, and the two parts are related by a data context and by binding. In simple terms, think of a set of labels in the view, with each having a matching label in the view model. A label in the view model is then attached to relevant functionality. The model isn't necessarily required, and I don't have one for the feature navigation add-in. Asynchronous programming is hugely significant because it's what allows the interface to remain responsive while processing tasks are being performed. So think of multi-threading as a motorway. The point is that the fast lane remains clear so that traffic can move along nicely, while tasks are performed in the other lanes where they may be slower without getting in the way. Central to how an add-in works is what's called DAML, which stands for Desktop Application Markup Language. It stores details on how functionality is arranged, as well as captions, tooltips, and images. It also stores instructions related to when functionality should be made available or hidden. Here's some DAML from my Feature Navigation add-in config file. The first part declares the GISPD Utils tab and refers to a single group that appears on that tab. The second part defines the group and refers to a button. This third part defines the button, including a condition attribute that states that the button should only be enabled when there's at least one map pane open. As you can see, you'll get one tooltip when the button is enabled and another when it's disabled. An interesting thing about the way ArcGIS Pro works is that just like the add-in has a config file, so too does the whole program. In other words, ArcGIS Pro consists of a big set of components that are pulled together as required when the program starts up, according to the instructions in the DAML file. And as you can see here, the add-in config DAML is simply merged into the program config file. Now let's look at building the add-in. I said earlier that we use Visual Studio for the development, and that requires adding the code pieces we need to create add-ins and to work with ArcGIS Pro. We create a new project and we choose the ArcGIS Pro module add-in template. The project then opens with this file. This is the config file for the add-in, which is written using a language developed by Esri and based on XML. It describes how pieces fit together, along with some of the UI features such as labels. It also includes instructions for when functionality should appear or disappear. Then we have the view. This is written using another XML-like language called XAML, and as you can see, there's a code section at the bottom and a design section at the top. And lastly, there's the view model, which supports the view. This can execute statement, which you see on multiple lines, is what allows us to easily tie button state to program conditions. So for example, the previous button is tied to code that says the button should be disabled if you're at the first field value in the list. When we're ready, we compile the project to create a small zip file with the extension .esriaddinx, and that's what we make available to the user. As you can see, the zip file consists of a couple of image folders, an install folder that holds the compiled code, and a copy of the config file. And we can just distribute that file in the same way as any other zip file. In order to make the add-in available to users, we can just give them the add-in file. They can double-click on it and an installation utility opens. Click Install and the file is copied to a folder that ArcGIS Pro checks on startup. If it finds any add-in files, the add-ins are then loaded. ArcGIS Pro includes an add-in manager page where you can see details of add-ins that are installed and delete add-ins. On the options page, you can also control where ArcGIS Pro looks for add-in files and control the type of add-ins that can be installed. With that overview, let's look at add-in creation and deployment in more detail. Now I'd like to explain how I created the add-in using Visual Studio. I'm going to open the program. Create a new project. And then I'm going to search for a template. You can see I have various options, a manage configuration there, a metadata toolkit, a module add-in, a plugin, and down here there's a couple that relate to ArcGIS Server. And I'm going to pick ArcGIS Pro module add-in C#. Select that, click on Next, and then I'll accept these defaults and create the project. Project opens with the config DAML file. I'll skip that first piece, go straight to add-in info. Here's an ID value. It's a global unique identifier that just distinguishes my add-in from other add-ins in the world and other pieces of functionality. this piece here, this is the metadata, if you like, that appears in the add-in manager in ArcGIS Pro. And down below in this modules section, this is where you describe the components of your add-in, the way that they relate to each other, and the way that they interact with the system. So there's a tab section. Currently commented out in there is a tab, and in the next section, the group section, there's a group available to us out the box, group 1, and then down here in this control section, this is where you would add things like buttons that would then tie back to the group. And you could also have other information down here describing, for example, a dockable window. One thing to mention, this insert module statement right here. I said that ArcGIS Pro has its own big DAML file, and then our DAML gets added to that, and then the whole thing gets read as the program starts up, and that defines how the whole thing looks and feels. What happens is when it gets to that insert module statement there, it looks across and it says, oh, you've got a piece of code under this class name variable here. You've got a piece of code called module 1, and it will go and look for it, and then it'll just load it like any other code. So that's the way that works. Now there isn't much going on in here apart from this, so I'll close this, and then let's have a look at the feature navigation add-in code, because there's more to see there. So here's the config DAML for the feature navigation add-in. This is the descriptive piece and the ID up there again, and here's the modules part. So if you remember, there was the tab, which was the GISPD Utils tab. There's its caption right there. It referred to a map group, and the map group is defined here. And then within that, there's a button, show button, and that button is defined right here. And this is where the tooltip text was defined for the enabled and the disabled states. And then down at the bottom, lastly, we have the dock pane description. One thing to mention for that button, that should be disabled if there's no map pane that's active. So if I scroll across here, there's a condition there. It says condition Esri map pane, and that's what turns the button from enabled to disabled or vice versa. If I now open this file, this is the XAML file. This is what defines the view, and that's the front end basically. So if I skip over this little bit here and go straight to this, this is like an HTML table in a way. It's just a way of laying out the pieces of the add-in and just making sure that they're all organized and they don't move around too much in this particular case. So up here you've got a designer, there's the map section, there's the layer, there's the field, and they correspond to pieces down below. So if I just scroll down a second, you'll see the map piece here. That ties to the designer piece there. And going back up a second, this first piece relates to the info message. Now what that is if you remember, when I closed a map pane that was currently associated with the add-in didn't like that, so it told me that the tool has been reset because the selected map was closed. This XAML that we're looking at here is what defines that message. So there's two parts. This is the part with the little X, it's a button with an image, and that's the X that you use to close the info message. And then the other piece down here is the text block. That's where the message itself is written, and it's got a yellow brush here, so it appears in yellow. Now, here's the map panes piece, and there's a combo box, and it says item source binding map panes. Remember that for now. I'm going to come back to that. Now, this is the view model, and this is the logic for behind the scenes that makes the view work, if you like. And at the top here, we've got some things that are just like import statements in a program like Python. If I scroll down, this namespace, just think of that as a folder full of code. And then in here, we've got a class, and that's just think of it as a container for what are called properties, so bits of information, along with functionality, which are called methods. Functions are called methods if they're part of a class. And at the top here, I've just got some variables that are attached to the class, and they hold strings that provide labels and info messages and things like that. And down below here, I've got some commands, right? Now, this is where I get back to what I was referring to a second ago with the map panes. Let's just look at this apply command as an example. I said before that the view and the view model are connected to each other by, just think of them as labels for now. So there's a label here called apply command. Technically, it's actually a property of the class. This apply command label here I go and look for it in the XAML here, there it is. So we've got a button that's called apply, and it says command equals binding apply command. That's the connection that establishes the connection between the front and the back. Now if I go back to the view model a second, and then I go and I look for it in here, you'll see some more information relating to that apply command. And this is in the piece of code that is the first to run when this thing starts up. And what it says is apply command is what's called a relay command. Don't worry about that for now. But what it's doing is saying it ties to a function called apply, and that's the function that does the work if you click the button. And it also ties to this thing called canExecute, which is another function. And what canExecute does is returns a true or false value to determine whether or not that button should be enabled or disabled. So if I hit a button here and just pop straight down to that function, you'll see in here canExecute equals false, and this happens to be the return value right there. It comes out of that function, goes back to where we just were. And here is the section for apply, and you'll see it says canExecute equals field values present and field values selected. Now that's my fancy clear variable name at work there, because the idea is that you can read it very easily. So if there is a field value and if there is a field value selected, then this button should be enabled, which we saw in the demo. And likewise, if the condition isn't met, it would be disabled. So this is a nice, neat way of tying together conditions with the state of the controls on the form. And you can see below the same principle applies for clear definition query and clear selection. So let's go back up here a little bit, and let's scroll back to the top, and let's just return to map panes, because I alluded to that in a few moments ago. So here's map panes. I'll just scroll down. There you go. Now this is the label that corresponds to the label that we looked at just earlier on in the XAML. And in this case, what this pertains to is an observable collection. So just think of it as a bag full of map panes. That's the easiest way to think about it for now. Bag full of map panes, and that is what is used to load that drop-down list. So back over here, if I just scroll up to map panes, back up here somewhere, there we go, there's map panes. It's a drop-down list, a combo box in technical terms, and that list there holds the map pane objects. And then when one is selected, we can just go and grab that selected map pane object and just do something with it, like get the map view, get the map, and then get the layers from the map. Now I jump straight across to the apply function here, and this is the function that I referred to earlier, and I said this is what actually runs when you click on the button, and this is what does something. So the piece to focus on here is not so much all this stuff here, but the try catch piece is what I want to focus on. So this is the error handling part of it, and what happens is the code's coming along. Let's say it arrives on this line that says set definition query here. Let's say something bad happens. It will immediately jump down into this block of code under where it says catch, and then the system gives our code a piece of information in the form of this exception object. So there's a variable there called exception that refers to an object, and that object contains information about the error, what happened, and that sort of thing. And so then what I do is I wrap that up. I basically attach that to another object here called catch exception, and don't worry about why I do that for now. And then catch exception gets passed to a function called show error message. So if I click on show error message, and I'm just going to hit a button here that goes to the corresponding function, this is the function that gets called then, and it receives that catch exception error object. And what it does, it says error message, which is a variable set elsewhere. Error message is equal to error utils, which is just the name of a file, basically, think of it that way for all intents and purposes. Create error message, and then it passes it that error object from there. And if we go and look over there at that one, I'm pressing another button to move to it, And here we are at create error message. So what that does is just first it goes and it compiles the error details, and then it uses those error details to create a nice clean message, and that is the message that appears, if you remember, in ArcGIS Pro down at the bottom here, so that we can see that, and it just looks like this one at the top, except it's in red. So we just go back to the code here again. And the point of doing it this way is not only is it nice and clean and neat, but if we decide that, well, we don't want to show an error message on the screen like that, well, we want to redirect that message to a database or to an email or something like that, it's easy to do that. There's basically 1 or 2 lines, and that's it. So this is a versatile approach. And this create error message is in, if you look over here in error utils, you can see it there as well. This is a separate document, it's a separate block of code, and I can use that in any application I like. I just follow the same approach every time for error handling, and it works really, really well. Now, if you assume that we've finished this project, everything's great, then what I do is I compile it, and I basically run a build command, as it's called. So Control-Shift-B, and you'll see down at the bottom it says build started. And if anything bad happened while it was compiling, it would say so, but in this case it succeeded. So what happened then was this. Let's say I go and I open up a window here. I'm just going to skip out of this folder and go to Business, Esri, ArcGIS Pro, SDK, Utils, Feature Navigation Add-in. So basically the depths of my add-in code here. Bin, debug. Made it. And what you see in here, there's an add-in X file that just got created. 4:48 is the time now when I'm doing this. That just got created. And if I double click on that, the install utility opens. And all the install utility does, I'll just cancel it for now, is copy it to a well-known folder location. Now, go over here, this is the folder location where it puts it. So there's the Feature Navigation Esri Add-in X folder there. This is inside My Documents, Users, David, Documents, ArcGIS Pro. And it made a folder with the name composed of that long ID that we saw earlier in the config file. So it made that folder, and then it simply put the Esri Add-in X file there. Now what I've done, I did this already, is I've unzipped that, and if you look inside it, you can see there's dark images, the install, like we saw earlier on the slide, and that's the piece of code there, that's the core thing, and then the config YAML file, and that's exactly like we saw earlier. So that's how it got installed. We basically compiled it, and there's just a step in between where we send the add-in to someone, you know, via the email or whatever, or we put it on a network drive, something like that, and off it goes. And then if you open ArcGIS Pro here, go to the project, go to the add-in manager, there it is. You can see there's feature navigation, there's the metadata. I could delete the add-in, I won't do that right now. I could click on options, and this is where I could specify folders. And so if you're a network administrator, you could say, all right, I've got this folder here, this is for add-ins, and then ArcGIS Pro will know to go and look in that folder when it starts up and find them. And then you can change the security conditions. You can say, okay, only load Esri ones, only load those with a trusted digital signature, or otherwise just load everything like that. So you've got some control over whether add-ins are allowed in programs. So that's it for the add-in creation and deployment demo. Now I'd like to talk about events. To start with, I need to set the scene for what I'm about to explain. Here we can see one of the map panes from my demo. In code terms, the map pane has a map view, and the map view has a map. The map represents the underlying data, and the map view handles interactions with that data, such as panning, zooming, and interactive querying. When you're developing an add-in that relies on the map, you have to know when the map object becomes available, and that depends on the map view, which depends on the map pane. This is where events come in. When something happens in the program, an event occurs, and you can listen to events and respond as required. Subscribing tells the program that you want to know when an event occurs. And when you subscribe, you tell the program that it should run a function. In that function, you can have code to do something in response to the event occurring. In this example, the first line of code says that we want to be notified when the active map view changes, and when it does, run a function. The function to call is onActiveMapViewChanged, and when it runs, the system gives it some information in an arguments object. That arguments object tells us which map view is being activated and which one is being deactivated. Let's say we switch from one map pane to another, map 1 to map 2 in this example, and we want to get the map object to load the layers dropdown. What actually happens in terms of the active map view changed event? It seems logical that the event object would tell us that the outgoing map would be map 1 and the incoming map would be map 2. Wrong. That's not how it works, but how would you know? I spent a lot of time struggling with this and decided to write another add-in to help me figure out what happens. It's called the Event Inspector add-in, and what it does is write the details from event objects to a text file as the events occur, which turns out to be extremely informative. This is what actually happens. Let's look at 4 steps. First, the onActiveMapViewChanged event occurs and suggests that we're leaving map 1, but it doesn't say where we're going. Then at the end, the onActiveMapViewChanged event occurs again and tells us we're at map 2, but it doesn't tell us where we've come from. In between those 2 events, the onActivePaneChanged event occurs and tells us we're going from the map 1 pane to the map 2 pane. Then the onMapViewInitialized event occurs and tells us we're at map 2. Until I saw the inspector output, I had no idea that this is the way that it worked. How else would I know? It's not written down anywhere. But once I knew this, I could put code in place to make my add-in responsive to map changes without bad things happening. And the great thing is that I can keep on adding code to report details for other events whenever I need to understand how the program works. Now let's take a look at some resources. These are the links for first the ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET landing page, the documentation, the API reference guide, the community samples, and the GeoNet community. Let's now look at each one of those in turn. So let's start with the ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET landing page. Here you can see the API reference, the community samples, documentation, so you've got links to primary resources there. You can get started with these tutorials, short 15 to 20 minute exercises, and then you've got key concepts down here, framework, editing, map exploration, and so on. So standard Esri help information there. Next, let's look at the documentation. This is on GitHub and gets updated fairly regularly. You see 2 types of document here. You've got pro snippets and pro concepts. So look at the pro snippets one first for framework in this case, and they're code samples and loads of them too. So you can take these, put them in your application and edit them as required. Let's just go back now and look at the framework pro concepts document. This is a really great document. This is probably the best one to read to start with because it gives you a sense of some of the core capabilities of the SDK and how it all works. So if I just scroll down, you'll see some familiar things I think by now. This is the add-in extensibility points section. It talks about buttons, split buttons, tools, and so on. So it goes into more detail, and then this is the jumping off point for more detail still in other pages. Configurations, that's the managed configurations I referred to earlier, plugin data source, and then go down here, there's a really important section. This is the introduction to DAML, the desktop application markup language. This is where you put pieces together and set conditions, labels, and so on. Now let's go over to the API reference. This is really the hardcore detail section. So if I go in and look at an example here, this is the mapping assembly. Go down and look at, say, map. Click on members here, and you'll see some things that I think are fairly familiar to you as ArcGIS Pro users. Here is the name, for example, the name property. So that's obviously quite standard. The layers is scene. Go down here, spatial reference. Standard stuff here that should all be familiar to you. Now I actually read this whole thing. There's about 100 pages in here, and I read the whole thing earlier this year, and that might sound really boring and nerdy or something like that, but it's not. What I was doing, I was looking at the samples And I realized that, well, this stuff isn't familiar. And rather than just going every time I saw something that I didn't quite understand, going and looking at this and then learning piece by piece like that, I thought, well, I'll read the whole thing, get a good sense of it all, and then things will be familiar when I see them in samples and help documents and so on. And it really worked. It was very effective. And even if you never use the SDK, it's worth having a look in here because it gives you a strong sense of the massive amount of capability of ArcGIS Pro and the things you can do with it. You find yourself thinking, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Go off and have a look. Now, this is the samples repository, and you can see down here it's got things like geometry. Let's go into the geometry group here, constructing geometries, geometry samples. You can even build yourself a Rubik's Cube if you want. So, hugely valuable resource there. Other things like framework, geodatabase, geoprocessing, and so on. And then lastly, we've got the GeoNet community, where you can go and ask people for help or see what other people asked and how people responded to their questions. So that's it for the resources. Now I'd like to bring things to a close with mention of some considerations. As you've seen, the SDK is based on .NET, so you can only program with C# or VB.NET. You must use WPF, but the MVVM pattern is optional. It's strongly encouraged though, and required if you want to distribute your add-in through the ArcGIS marketplace. If you want to upgrade a desktop add-in, your only option is to rewrite it. And bear in mind that most SDK capabilities can only be used within ArcGIS Pro. You can't write standalone programs like you can with ArcObjects, the only exception being the core host programs I mentioned earlier, which work with the geodatabase and geometry SDK functionality. So in summary, the ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET provides a rich and powerful mechanism for enhancing the value of the ArcGIS Pro investment. And if you want to learn how to use it, make the most of the available resources. Start very small and develop clean code, and keep plenty of backups and don't be afraid to break things. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and feel free to get in touch with comments or questions, or if you need any assistance.